that image, I wanted to introduce an image from the great Edward Gorey, one of my great influences as a writer. This is from his very first illustrated book called The Unstrung Harp, which is about an author named Mr. Earbrass, who is struggling to write his book, The Unstrung Harp. Of course, Edward Gorey went on to create many books in this format, but that were much more, often more grisly in content, often depicted children in peril, in his effort to capture the Victorian essence of reflection on childhood and kind of Victorian children's books. So Mr. Earbrass was driven over to Nether Millstone in search of forced green gages, but has been distracted by booksellers. Rummaging among mostly religious tracts and privately printed reminiscences, he has come across The Meaning of the House, his second novel. And making sure it has not got there by mistake, as he would hardly care to pay more for it, he discovers it is a presentation copy for Angus. Will you ever forget the bloaters? Bloaters? Angus? Which is pretty much the tone of the entire book, of a kind of melancholy and malaise, not an inspiring portrait of the creative process, certainly. So that, before I thrust my own work onto you for a second, I want to kind of lead this conversation, this subject of the book and of the writer as a subject for visual artists, into what Geraldine Brooks is doing, which is the book as a subject of literature. If you go on Wikipedia, there's a long list of what they call fictional books that is kind of fun to browse through, A to Z. There's authors, Margaret Atwood, A.S. Byatt, Douglas Adams, and the various books that they've created for their characters to read. Of course, J.K. Rowling, the entire list of textbooks that Harry Potter consults at his school of wizardry. And so it's, it's often fun to read about characters reading books and to see these titles and these authors that come from the imagination and the world of the book. But it also suggests, it raises the question of why that is a preoccupation for writers. And of course the most obvious one is that because that's what writers know best, and they love talking about themselves and their own processes. So it's a kind of navel-gazing to be able to write about the process that you're experiencing as you're doing it. And so that's kind of like the most obvious answer, I suppose. But there's also the writer's love for writing is generally because of a love for reading. And that relationship between reader and writer is fascinating to so many of us, I think. And it's so delicious to be able to go in there and explore that in a fictional world. But it can take peculiar forms, I think. I was reading John Irving's A Widow for 1 Year this summer, which is a novel that I love, but the first half of the book is about a children's book author and illustrator and the dysfunction of his life and the great loss in his family of his 2 teenage sons in a car accident. Very moving, powerful book that we get bits and pieces of his work as we're reading it, these fictional children's book novels that the writer is creating. And then part 2 of the book, we move ahead about 30 years, and his daughter, who's 4 years old in the first book, is now a novelist herself. And the unfortunate thing is that she's not nearly as interesting a novelist as John Irving or as the characters of the first part. And so John Irving boldly gives us a chapter early on in that part 2 from the book that Ruth is writing. And it's kind of a drag. And it doesn't realize the promise of, the book within does not realize the promise of the book on the outside, I guess. And so, so that's the risk that you take. And I think part of that is that contract, the negotiation that we have between writer and reader, so that as we're reading along, we're invested in this one story, and we don't want you to thrust upon us a story that we did not choose, I guess. We want to be reading John Irving's work, not the work of John Irving's character, necessarily. So, of course, there are examples of real books, non-fictional books in novels. That's another kind of rich literary history. The book that immediately comes to mind is The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which is kind of dedicated to the richness of Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. So we meet Virginia Woolf creating the novel, and then we meet a housewife in the 1950s who's experiencing the reading of the novel, discovering it and finding comfort in it. And then we meet a woman in turn of the century New York, this last turn of the century, at the end of the 1990s, an editor herself named Clarissa, leading a life very similar to that of Mrs. Dalloway, the character in the original book. Which, when I first picked up the book, The Hours, I thought, well, why does he get to do it? You know, why does he get to take, you know, that rich reading experience and those great characters and make them his own? You know? But he does it beautifully. So, but there is that sense of that possessiveness that we have as readers of the characters that we read about. We don't necessarily want to see them messed with. And before I read my own excerpt, I did also want to mention that one of my favorite books about writers and about the writing process is Misery by Stephen King. And I don't know that Stephen King has ever before been compared to Virginia Woolf, but I will do that here today. It's basically a piece of schlock horror. But within it is this very careful and rich meditation on the relationship between reader and writer, in the form of Annie Wilkes, a nurse who has discovered or found the author, the best-selling novelist, Paul Sheldon, after he's had a car accident. She's taken him in to nurse him back to health. Unfortunately, she's a psychopath. And so she's not so much nursing him back to health as holding him captive. And when she discovers that he's killed off her favorite character in a series of books, she commands that he bring her back to life. And he does so initially ineptly in her eye, and convinces him to return to the book and to be more creative in how he brings her back to life, because he killed her off at the end of the last book. And so she addresses this notion of feeling cheated, and she's speaking from a life as a reader, as someone who has gone to the movies and has felt cheated again and again by inept storytelling, and even though she ultimately becomes a monster, literally at the end of the book. Before that, we just see this childlike woman coming to terms, reconciling this issue of having her favorite novelist in her clutches and under her control, and all that means in terms of accomplishing reader satisfaction. I've been talking for a very long time. Does anybody have any questions or anything before I proceed? I just want to read just a little bit from this this book I'm working on now.